All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Tanche, Kia, Max Liboiron de Shinekashun, l'activiste du Chien, Nikia Metinishun. As Dr. Han said, my name is Dr. Max Liboiron. My pronouns are they, them. I am from Northern Alberta, Treaty 6 territory, a place called Lac La Biche, but I now live and work in Newfoundland and Labrador, which are the homelands of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu and the Inuit. And I work primarily with Inuit co-researchers on plastic pollution. What I'm going to be talking about today, assuming that these slides advance, which they do not. Oh, okay. Is what do we mean by justice anyhow? So I'm really glad that this conference has a framework of justice, right? And when I think about justice, I think about the actual chores of moving from an is to an ought. An orientation towards change of some kind. But what that ought means can get real fuzzy sometimes. And there's a few moments in my career. I've had a career as an activist, an academic, a researcher, a community person. And there's a few moments where the stakes of being really specific about what we mean by justice have become very clear to me. So one of them was when I taught an activist methods class, a graduate class. And one of my students said, you know, a lot of the methods, the activist methods we're talking about, are the same ones that the oil companies use that I study, like literally the same ones. And they are also, they have the same theories of change, actually. And I think they're activists. And a lot of the students at first were like, no, no, but we're like, actually, yes, yes. And you can't just discount them because they're the bad guys or something like that, out of the sort of techniques or parameters of understanding activism just because they have a very different ought, especially because a lot of their justice terms, sustainability, right, these were the exact same justice terms that other people were using. So there are some stakes, some very easy and clear stakes there. And making sure that there's a symmetry in science and technology studies is called symmetry. You study the failures as well as the successes. You study the bad guys as well as the good guys. You study, right, and just leaving off a whole group for those sorts of reasons results in very uneven research and ethics. So there's one lesson. Lesson number 2 comes out of Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's Decolonization is not a metaphor, right? Classic text, keystone text, if you're not familiar with it, written out of a frustration in academia of the term decolonization, meaning so very many things, from inclusion of Indigenous people on syllabi to like decolonizing your kitchen sink with a plumber who can smudge to all, you know, and they write it, which happens, by the way, that is a joke, but it is also real. There's, and how using decolonization in these very promiscuous terms ends up acting as an alibi for not doing what they're calling decolonization, which is land back, full stop. Indigenous land back, rematriation and patriation of land and life, full stop. Now there's now an Indigenous conversation around that very important paper being like, actually sometimes you have to use it as a metaphor because there's also specificity about how colonization is place-based and therefore so is decolonization. So there are Indigenous folks who need metaphors because of the way colonization has erased imaginations of certain types for decolonization. That doesn't mean everyone, you know, it's the specificities, and I'm going to talk about this quite a bit, is not just the content, but who's using the content, who's talking. Positionality is another way to talk about this. And then the third sort of crystallizing moment comes out of my lab. So I run as Dr. Han mentioned, a plastic pollution lab. I'm a physical scientist, a natural scientist, as well as a social scientist. And a lot of the work we do are looking at plastic pollution in Indigenous food webs, and specifically Inuit, and specifically Nunatsiavut Inuit food webs. And at one point in the lab, we had a militant vegan feminist and an Inuit and an Inuk, and they fundamentally disagreed about the seal hunt in a way that was very not okay in terms of Indigenous sovereignty. But they could also agree on a lot of other points. And so for a couple of years after, a big part of my mentorship and lab leadership was like, okay, how do we maintain differences, understand that our priority is one of these forms of justice and not all the forms of justice, and talk about where we can and cannot overlap, right? It's not easy, right? And that's sort of been what I've been working on ever since. So what I'm going to talk about today are two brand new studies that are not yet published, but should be any second now on one of them because we've approved the proofs, of basically two data-driven analyses of like WTF justice, basically. Like, what do people mean? It's a bit of a hot mess. What does this hot mess look like specifically so that we can maneuver it in a good way? Would be our research question. What is hot mess? How to maneuver it? So there's two studies I'm going to talk about. One is a systematic study of scientists who study plastic pollution in their peer-reviewed literature, who are using justice terms, but are using them in all sorts of ways that will sometimes work against each other in the same paper, and sometimes align in really unexpected ways. The second piece is a commissioned paper that I wrote in light of the plastic treaty coming in through the UN, where I look at all the different research, journalism, NGO, grey literature on Indigenous participation in plastic pollution governance, and it becomes WTF participation, which is linked intimately to justice, right? Who's there doing what, right? So those are the two papers I'll look through. Even though they're about plastics in particular and that sort of stuff, I think they'll generalize to a lot of different cases of pollution and a lot of different models of justice. So this is the first paper. See, it's a proof. It should be out any minute now. So there's what we have here is, oh, I've got a pointer. Oh, I love the pointer. So myself, we've got a social scientist, we've got a law student, and we've got a professional chemist on this paper, because that's literally who we needed to do this analysis. And what happened is that both Mari and I, who are scientists, like physical scientists, not scientists, social scientists are real scientists too. Elitist scientists, that's what we are. Natural scientists, we would read these peer-reviewed science papers, and there would be all these, we would get these gut brain feelings, where like something was off, something was on, something was off again, and even in these, so a lot of scientists don't actually believe in objectivity, FYI, we know it's like super weird, but we have to publish towards that to get our pubs. And so in the performance of objectivity, scientists were still making normative claims about an ought, but they were getting all twisted up in different ways. And so we're like, let's get this sorted. Let's sort of see what's going on. And so for those of you who attended, so this is my search string. This is your second search string of the night if you went to the talk before this. Basically, we did a lit review of different models of justice that are already out there. And then we made this search string to try and encompass as many different operative models of justice as we could. So this is one chunk of our search. There's also and then a bunch of plastic terms, which I will not bore you with because it's mostly chemistry. But so everything from like just justice and injustice to talking about ethics and morals, to talking about equality and equity, right, the DEI situation, talking about racism and anti-racism, those sorts of models, talking about like the indigenous colonization nexus, the different ways that people talk about the confluence of race and class, so like underserved, right, these sorts of terms, food deserts, disability and ableism, and then the capitalist sort of nexus, workers' rights, classism, this sort of stuff. We got some misogyny and patriarchy over here, right? So nature rights. We tried to cast a really big net. And we caught in our net 755 papers after we excluded the ones that were not justice. And these were terms in the title, keywords, and abstract, right? 755. We're like, oh my God, this is amazing. This bunch of papers, all these justice people, scientists. And what we found, so we did a bunch of different analyses. So I'm going to talk about one. I also did a network analysis. So if there's a network analysis, keyword analysis geek in the room, in the Q&A, we can look at my network analysis. But these were the 5. These are the 5 different models that were most prevalent. And they're ranged from completely ubiquitous to most common to scarce to like my papers. And one other person that I now emailed and are friends with. So my papers were also caught in this, which is nice. But ubiquitous was what we called developmental justice, which is aligned a little bit with some of what I said, like the oil company activism. But these are scientists who are also environmentalists using a lot of the same terms. So this idea that, so a lot of this would appear, say, in introductions. Plastic pollution is increasing exponentially, and so is, therefore, plastic pollution, full stop, no critique, moving on. Right? So that's a future-oriented term about an ought, about just industry's got to grow. It's going to grow, full stop. So that got captured. But also a lot of conversations about economic harms of plastic pollution, like to aquaculture, right, or to fishing, or to tourism. And a lot of scientists would do this maneuvering because they understand that this is a really dominant mode of justice to try and take the results and move them into economic spaces, even if it was sometimes a little tenuous. Distributive justice, which is a classic mode of talking about justice, right? Uneven harms and benefits, except for mostly uneven harms. This is basically occupational health and epidemiology, right? Occupational health is workers are disproportionately exposed to contaminants. It is in the literal study design itself. And this was there was a ton of occupational health stuff that got cut up in here. Workers, nail salon workers, all the way to plastic pollution workers. But also a little bit on like global southness, mostly from NGO folks. A lot of it was downstream, like looking at the effects. Procedural justice, another classic type of justice. Talking about who and how people are involved in decision making, right? Policy. Scientists love a good discussion of policy in their recommendation outro section, right? It's how that mostly appeared. This also included a lot of calls of scientists to be involved in data-oriented decision making, science-based decision making, that scientists weren't at the table and scientists should be at the table. That was super common. So these were like the biggie ones, and I'll show you how biggie. So this is a word tree showing how many. So each of these percentages is like a number of papers. So 23% of all papers just did distributive justice. This is like epidemiology. That's all they would have to do, maybe. And then a lot of them were combos. And so even though developmental justice isn't the most common, it is in every mix. It is ubiquitous, right? So it was everywhere, even though it wasn't the mostest. It becomes the mostest through ubiquity. Environment first justice are when we referred to the rare papers, even in science, where claims about how animals, flora, fauna, animals, plants, things that are neither, like bacteria or both, shouldn't be harmed by plastic, full stop. And that was regardless of whether the paper proved there was harm or not. And that, from a scientific perspective, is super radical. Scientists saying, my results didn't prove that plastics harm birds. P.S. plastics harm birds. Plastics are bad for birds. Right? And actually, there is an independent scientific study by scientists being like, look at that did a study like that of all the scientists making unscientific claims about harm, including when their science didn't back it up. 1/3 of all papers on plastic pollution make these kinds of claims, justice-based claims, right? So this isn't rare. This does not include ecosystem services, which is this. It does not include when people we're talking about like whales and then talked about whales' importance to like emotional health of humans, which happens bizarrely often. This is just the plants and animals hanging out just as plants and animals without recourse to human desires, needs, or whatever. Quite rare. And then indigenous sovereignty. So this doesn't include the inclusion of indigenous people in like, we've got really high body burdens, which we do. That's straight up distributive justice. This is about indigenous people governing our lands and peoples and waters and kin and this sort of stuff. And again, mostly my papers. So conflict of interest, PS, right there. So what I want to talk about a little bit is where these started to clash with each other in the same papers. Right? And this is part of why we published this paper, is to help researchers, not just scientists, but all researchers, be more careful about what they mean, because they would be like, yeah, and then their conclusion would be like, no, and you're like, how? Anyway, so I'll talk about some examples of how that happened. So the most common was probably the the anti and the pro-developmental folks in the same one. Plastic pollution is increasing exponentially. That is bad. That is the root of the problem. The solution is better growth. You're like, what? Like swapping out chemicals or more recycling, which is PS, an industrial process, right? This sort of stuff. Sometimes it would be developmental justice that created distributive justice problems. So more recycling, PS, the entire global north sends their recycling to the global south still, even after China did the sword policy, right? So justice in the north results in injustice in the south, super common, right, in some of the recommendations. Or a discussion of how incineration is a really good idea, but most of that's export to mostly Southeast Asia, who does incineration of global north wastes. Upstream and downstream distributive justice. So papers that proved that mostly Black, Indigenous, people of color, low income, women, and children have disproportionate body burdens and disproportionate harms and outcomes. So they would prove that this was, these occupational health and epi studies would prove that this was a systemic issue. Could not be described randomly, right? A lot of statistical power. And so they would prove that this was a systemic issue, and then the recommendations would be like, Black folks got to make better choice about their beauty products. And you're like, what? You just proved that's a super stupid way to get, right? Anyway, so that would happen across, like, you know, pregnant women got to be careful about what they consume. You're like, dude, they got to breathe. Anyway, so this sort of conflation of upstream and downstream distributive justice, right? The problem is upstream, the solutions are downstream, literally impossible, right? Very, very common and very, very frustrating. Procedural justice and developmental justice get married and have a weird baby. And that was where scientists are like, much more science is needed. We need to be on, we are the ones who have shown that there are distributive justice problems. You know, people of color have more body burdens. Put us on the policy making table, but like not the folks with the high body burdens. You're like, oh, that, and so it's still procedural justice. It's still talking about a diversification of who's involved, but it never, almost never included these folks, and always called for more science. Always called for more science. I'll talk about that more in a moment, about how like we actually don't really need more science as a scientist. And then there's this creepy thing about how a lot of these were the opposite of this. And a lot of Indigenous folks in the room are like, yep, I know this is my every Tuesday. But things about how more and better access to policy making over Indigenous land for non-Indigenous people of a variety of types. About how more and better recycling that use Indigenous land and resources. More and better commons that are based on Indigenous lands, right? A lot of these often, and even environment first, better conservation to the exclusion of Indigenous people, right? So a lot of these, even if they were otherwise good, often were explicitly or implicitly against Indigenous sovereignty. Right? And this is a huge part of my book and my other work too. So, what's my next discussion? This. Yep, we already talked about that. So this is just, a lot of scientists aren't trained how to talk about justice, but most scientists go into plastic pollution research because their brain gut wants to do good in the world, right? And so there's this very clear need for us to be much better and more explicit about joining our science brain and our gut brain. Right, our sort of justice orientation things. And I don't think it's fundamentally helpful to just critique scientists and be like, y'all don't know what you're doing. We're not trained in everything all the time, as are most researchers not trained in everything all the time. But trying to figure out, okay, so what are some different models of justice that we do want to stand behind? How do we make sure that our studies reflect them and also our recommendations? Because that was the biggest cut, where the intro and the conclusion would have different models of justice fighting each other. Or the design would be one place and the interpretation would take like a sharp left, right? Or something like that. So how do we join these things up? And how do we marry these well? Like what would a really good distributive plus environment first justice be like? Because a lot of scientists actually fall over here. But we're consistently trained that this is not a good enough argument, scientific argument, right? But I think it could be, right? So these are some of the things that I get left with this paper. All right, this is the other paper. This is a commission piece for the UN treaty thing, where a lot of people want to talk about Indigenous participation in plastic pollution governance. What is the state of the field? I don't know, hang on, let me do a systematic review. So that's what we did. Ooh.
Sorry, that's my fault. Go ahead. Sorry. Totally my fault.
Okay, so I'm not going to show you my search string for this one, but same sort of thing. We ended up with 70 papers, not just papers, texts. So we actually blew this one open a little bit because we knew that peer-reviewed publications would account for a very small number of Indigenous authored type things that talk about Indigenous participation. So we opened it up to Google, just Google, not just even Google Scholar, although that too. So we got a lot of journalism, we got a lot of NGO reports, we got a lot of blog posts, we got a lot of nation websites, as well as peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, and the occasional presentation conference proceeding. But that's not the community. That's folks like us, right, who are in the business of making words, right? So this isn't a community snapshot. This is a folks like us snapshot. And we analyzed it a bunch of different ways. I'm mostly going to talk about ones. I realize this is very hard to read, and I will give you a zoom in a moment. But one of the ways we analyzed this was to code all the different terms for participation. And so what you can see here, here's your WeZoom, is opposition. So Indigenous people fighting is the most form of participation. Critique, challenge, roadblocks, train blocks, pipeline blocks, riding their horse into the city hall, arguments, the whole range of opposition is the most common. And this is a body of work talking about good Indigenous participation, and you still end up with us fighting as our most common bone. But what I want you to notice, if you go back to this key down here, they're color coded. So dark orange is Indigenous organization. So that's usually nations or journalism pieces about nations. And a few NGOs that are Indigenous, all Indigenous. Light orange is Indigenous first author, often with other Indigenous authors, sometimes solo, sometimes mixed, but Indigenous first author, meaning they're in the decision-making role in the paper. Gray means mixed author list, where there was one Indigenous person, usually just one, in the larger author list. They were not first. They were only ever middle or end, 100% of the time. Light blue is non-Indigenous first author and no Indigenous people anywhere in the author list. And then dark blue is a non-Indigenous and almost exclusively settler, government or NGO. So what you'll notice in opposition is that everybody talks about it except for government. Huh, how weird. Everybody talks about partnership, but really a lot of partnership from these mixed groups with non-Indigenous first authors. Huh, what's up with that? A lot of people want to collect data from Indigenous people, almost exclusively non-Indigenous folks. So at this point, we're like, okay, this count thing is not working. We got to talk about authorship as the primary way to analyze this data. All right, here's some more trees. All right, so this is Indigenous authors, both nations and first authors. So Indigenous folks in decision-making roles. And most of us are talking about opposition, but there's a lot of rights-based discussion. Treaties, Indigenous-led rights, sovereignty, right? A lot of the rights-based and sovereignty-based discussion. There are basically three different giant categories to talk about participation. There is the inclusion model, bring Indigenous people, seat at the table, which you'll see, it'll pop up. I'm not being helpful. I'm waving this around. Anyway, they're seated at a table in almost all of these, but seat at the table, right? Bringing Indigenous people in, inclusion into empire, add Indigenous and stir. And then there was rights-based and sovereignty, right? Indigenous people aren't just stakeholders, we're rights holders. We're actually a different kind of participant because of that, with actually a very different role than other types of stakeholders. And then there was Indigenous environmental justice, where the terms of the entire shebang was characterized by Indigenous epistemologies, worldviews, ways of knowing, ethics, etc. Ontologies, axiologies, epistemologies, if you're a fancy speaking person. But if you're a normal person, all the stuff. All the stuff. The world, the thinking, the doing good. So I'm just going to take you through some of these. So right, Indigenous folks talking a lot about collaboration, but the collaborations are based in Indigenous rights. right? So people are, the joining up is based in Indigenous leadership and sovereignty, right? Mixed authors list a lot about the partnership, the collect, which is rude, right? But all of this co stuff, and even decision making, except none of them had Indigenous first authors. And most of them didn't describe in their methods how that decision making happened. And so if they're talking about Indigenous decision making, like how did that happen in their actual work? So it talks about that sort of ideation, but it was missing out of their methods, which I know a lot of Indigenous people in the room know this in our guts and our inboxes. This happens all the time, is that partnerships are proposed, but the terms of those partnerships remain in the dominant paradigm, even when they're using terms like decision-making and collaboration and co and co and co. Right? The co is always uneven, and it's always going to be uneven. Right? I'm not saying like let's find a way to become the same, because that's also very problematic, and I can talk about that. But it means that we don't know what this means, right? When these words get thrown around. These ones are, like the critiques are just like right there, so they're a little more fun. Number one, non-Indigenous authors talking about collecting data from Indigenous people as the number one type of participation. So like right back to the extractive paradigm. Participation is extraction, right? Collaboration, but how? No one is writing with you, unsure, right? But using these sorts of terms. And not community-led. How did you have a whole, no, what? Community-led and no authors, how is it, what's led how? Led what? I don't understand. And then these folks, Glenn Coulthard will be very happy with this data-driven analysis of his thesis in Red Skin, White Masks, which is that the settler state's recognition of Indigenous people relies on Indigenous legibility to the settler state and is controlled by the terms of the settler state. And so terms like recognition, consideration, inclusion are always on the state's terms, the settler state's terms, right? Accountability is mixed in there. Good, interesting, good. Here's our seat at the table. Here's an overlap. Employment and entrepreneurship was talked about quite a bit by settler NGOs and governments, and it's also talked quite a lot about by Indigenous groups. So like, give us the money, give us the infrastructure. If we're gonna govern, we need the stuff. Governance requires some stuff, pens and pencils at the least, right? So there is also overlap in some of these. And we can talk about some of those, and you can see some of the overlaps in this kind of data viz. I'm not gonna get into it, but we can talk about it. So this author thing really matters. And so this, this did not turn out as an image, but there's Russia, and here's Canada. This is the north, and the dots are all there, and the dots really matter. So the blue dots are non-Indigenous everything, organizations, author lists, et cetera. The dark orange are Indigenous-led, whether that's nations or first authors, and the peachy is the mixy. Right, so Indigenous authors not first, but somewhere in the mix. And what you see is a global South divide on who is controlling the conversation about what participation looks like. And actually this is like 3 white ladies who are very prolific writers, right? This happens a lot in plastic pollution and other sort of specialized research, is that one research group comes to dominate a certain, it's called a matrix, but like plastic pollution and water or plastic pollution governance in an area, right? And this is Australia, and now I show my ignorance. New Zealand?
Nope.
New Zealand? New Zealand? Anyway, Australia, for sure. There we go, yeah. This is Tina Nagata. Yes, the Zoom folks know what's happening. All right, this is Tina Nagata. That's her work, and she's in New Zealand. So, but yeah, so in the global South, these are the terms of participation entirely in plastic pollution governance. So we actually have this distributional justice problem as well on top of this. Yeah, this was a little bit scary. And you can see us, we're fighting over here, having some arguments. I'm gonna skip this. So the close reading of these was that in the orange dots, the Indigenous-led papers, the conversation was fundamentally different. What plastic pollution was, how it was defined, and therefore what the solutions were, or the interventions, were fundamentally different. And so the add indigenous and stir thing, the inclusion model, doesn't do this, can't get there, cannot get to indigenous environmental justice, didn't get there, according to the corpus and the state of the knowledge. So relationships first was the most, like, so plastic pollution, yeah, there's like cancer and toxicity and endocrine disruption, and food web stuff, but it's mostly about the interruption of our relationships to land and our obligations and our first instructions, and that's the harm. That was not mentioned in the policy papers. I don't think you even could mention that in the policy papers because it doesn't make so much sense. So like threshold levels, NATO, that just doesn't make sense. Like these sorts of recycling, it just does not track in the industry responsibility, does not track in this sort of problem definition in the same way. I'm not going to go through all of these. But there are certain things, like holism, this idea that plastics includes like extraction to disposable, that's actually quite common in non-indigenous critiques of waste as well, right? And so there are some moments where mixed author or non-indigenous authorship of some kind did hit on some of these things, but this package and this as an approach was only in the indigenous authored pieces. And could, I would say, only be in the indigenous authored pieces. And so this is why the inclusion model can't make this, which is the dominant way of talking about it quantitatively. Yeah. So like nice critique, so what? I find critique really annoying as a science. So like people critique like the power dynamics of science all the time, and I'm very familiar with those, but then I gotta go put on my lab coat and get some stuff done. And so like critique will only get me so far. I'm like, okay, I know the stuff not to do. What do I do with this test tube? So most of what I've talked about is the state of the knowledge on these sorts of areas, or the state of sort of the way people are using or mushing up justice. I do want to emphasize that there are a lot of unexpected synergies, right? So like one of the examples was the settler governments and the indigenous folks being like entrepreneurship, jobs, infrastructure for those things, permanent, not contract. Total agreement. Right? Academics didn't get in on that, right? But it's what mattered. Wow, interesting. So unexpected synergies, and I think this is, I think this also goes back to my student who are like, well, industry are activists too, because the long part of that conversation is sometimes, yeah, it doesn't mean you're going to go hug industry, but it means that sometimes you can find very unexpected points of synergy for a moment, for a struggle that line up, and things are so shitty you're going to take that. I mean, making sure it's ethical and et cetera, but like, you just can't kick someone out of a partnership because, you just can't kick someone out of the partnership. You actually have to evaluate it on a bunch of different terms, sort of automatically. Specificity, this is what all my work is about. What do you mean by justice? What do you mean by abolition? What do you mean by participation? What do you mean by seat at the table? Whose seat, whose butt? Walking the talk. So all of these, I mean, this is really for these folks, right? People who have the mixed and these ideas about community-led with no community people, talking about decision-making when no one's in a decision-making role in the paper. I know there are reasons that indigenous people aren't always first authors, and a lot of them are very good reasons, but an entire corpus, bit odd, right? So what's happening here? Right? So how do you walk the talk? Talk the walk, walk the talk. Do the thing you say in the research itself at all the stages, instead of just putting the very important idea out there, but like not doing the good stuff the whole way. I am jet lagged and it's hitting me now. And then who we're listening to. We know, I mean, if you're in the humanities, social sciences, media, that sort of stuff, we know about positionality. We know it matters, but damn it, it so matters. It matters so much. And even though I'm big on positionality, and I know this, when I saw this, I was like, holy shit. Excuse me while I go check my Zotero and my bibliographies, because I think I have some bias that is because I'm not looking at these folks the most, and I'm not prioritizing them systematically. I prioritize them in my heart, which does not lead to a certain type of outline in a paper. You know what I mean? I need to be more systemic about this. Yeah. That's my last slide, and therefore that is the end of my talk. Thank you.